Hello and welcome back to Parallax Scrolling for web design. Now before we jump into our jQuery, I wanted to do one more thing, one more little bit of CSS coding. I want to spice up the headers a little bit. All of these H2 tags are kind of plain and white. I just want to make them a little bit bigger and alter the color of them just a little bit. So I'm going to jump into our code, and we're dealing with the files we ended with in lesson 11. So we're dealing with the lesson 11 end folders, and everything that we end up with in this video is going to go into the lesson 12 end folder. So we're going to go into our CSS, go to main.css, and we're going to find our content section. And what I want to do is I want to point to the H2 tags within those articles. So we'll point to content, and I'm doing this just after the content article rule. We'll do content space article space H2. So we're pointing to the H2 tags within those articles. We're going to set the color equal to a value of B2C1CD, which is a light blue color. And we'll set our font size here to 34 pixels, a nice big bold font. And then I'm going to also set the margin bottom to 0. So there's no extra spacing below that H2. So let's save that, jump back into our browser and refresh. And there we go. That's a lot closer to what I was looking for. Okay, so now let's jump into jQuery and start making this thing work. So we're going to, we're not going to actually open up our jQuery file here. We're going to go into our JavaScript folder and make a new file. And we're going to call this parallax.css. Okay, so in that file, we'll get started making this work. So just like we did last time, I want to start with our parallax function. So we'll create a function called parallax, just like we did before. Open and close parentheses, and then our opening and closing curly bracket for that function. And just like we did last time, we're going to create a variable called scroll position. And inside that variable, we're going to store a value based on how far down the scroll bar has been moved. So we're going to point to $, and then in parentheses, window. And I'm not getting the, oh, I know what I did. I called this .css. Let's change this file name here. I'm going to go ahead and save it and close it. And then I'm going to right click on that file name, rename it parallax.js. And now we should get the proper code coloring there. Yeah, that looks a lot better. Okay, so we're pointing to, again, we've created this variable called scroll position, and we're setting that variable equal to window dot scroll, and then top with a capital T, open and close parentheses, semicolon to end your statement. So now that we've got the position of the scroll bar stored in this variable, we can then make our calculations. So first of all, we're going to do for the stars the same thing we did for the grid in the first project. We're going to point to the stars div, which has a ID of stars applied to it. So we have to type £stars inside single quotes here. And then we're going to change the CSS of that item, of that fixed stars background. And the property that we're going to deal with here is the top property. And we're going to set it equal to, remember, if it was moving the same speed as the text, we would set it equal to 0 minus that scroll position variable. And then in order to get that to work properly, we would also need to add plus and then px inside single quotes there, and then a semicolon to end our statement. So again, this line of code, if we were to set this in motion now, this would scroll that background at the same rate that our text is scrolling, because we've just set it basically to the negative of the scroll position. So again, that would scroll at the same rate as the text. But right now it's not going to do anything because we've just created this function and we haven't linked it to an event handler yet. So let's move this function down and let's create our document ready function for our jQuery. So we'll put our $sign here, and then inside parentheses, we're going to point to document, and then we'll say .ready, and then inside parentheses, we'll type function, open and close parentheses, opening curly bracket, and then we'll put the closing curly bracket and closing parenthesis down here. So inside this function, we're going to bind the scroll event just like we did before. And so we're going to do that by pointing to $sign and then inside parentheses, window dot bind, and we're going to bind the scroll event. So inside single quotes, we'll type scroll, and that's simply how you bind something to the scroll event so that you cause something to happen over and over again as you're scrolling the scroll bar. And what we're going to do whenever that happens is we're going to trigger a function. So we'll type function, again, open and closed parentheses. This time we need an E inside the parentheses. Even though we're not going to use that E variable, we need to put it there. And then we'll put our opening curly bracket here. And then after we skip a couple lines, we'll have our closing curly bracket and closing parentheses and semicolon to end that statement. And then inside this function, we'll put a call to the parallax function that we created. So now, as we're scrolling our window, this event listener here is going to trigger this parallax function to run over and over again. So let's save that. And this isn't actually going to work until we put a reference to it in our index.html file. So up here in the head of the document, we're going to go to the end of this first script tag, and we'll create another script tag, and we'll set its source equal to js/parallax.js. And then we'll put our closing script tag after that. So we'll save that, jump into our browser, refresh our page, and hopefully now we'll see our text or our stars scrolling with our text, and it looks good. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want these stars to scroll a lot slower than the text itself. So let's jump back into our code and make that happen. We'll go back to our parallax.js file, and remember this calculation right here, 0 minus scroll position, is simply setting the top value of that star field equal to the negative of the scroll position, which will allow it to scroll at the same speed as the text. Well, remember, if we want it to scroll at a slower speed, all we have to do is multiply this variable by some fraction. So if we wanted it to move at 20% of the normal scroll speed, we would just multiply scroll position times 0.2. So I'm going to do that inside parentheses. So there's our opening parenthesis. And then after scroll position, we'll say times 0.2, and then our closing parenthesis for that. So make sure that we have two closing parentheses here to match up with this one, and then a third closing parenthesis here to match up with this one over here. So make sure you've got all your parentheses in place. It can get pretty confusing if we don't do that. So once that's done, let's save our file, and hopefully now our stars will be scrolling a lot slower than the text itself, and it looks pretty good. So what we want to do here is just scroll all the way down to the bottom and make sure that our stars extend all the way past the bottom edge. And it's always okay to jump back into our file here, go to our main.css file, scroll up to the stars background here, and then just make the height even taller than it currently is. We'll set it up at 8,000 pixels tall, because that's not going to change the amount of scrolling that we can do in the page, because remember, this is a fixed item. So we can make this as tall as we want to, and that won't put too much extra space at the bottom of the page, because again, it's not going to scroll past the point where our relatively positioned items are. Since this item is fixed, the height of that item is not going to affect the amount of scrolling that we're able to do. So it's good to make this a little bit taller than it needs to be, just in case you run past the edge of it. So we'll save that again. And then just to make sure we didn't break anything, we'll go ahead and refresh the page and then try it again. And everything looks good so far. Okay, so now that we've got our text scrolling and our stars scrolling, in the next video, we're going to get our images scrolling as well, because our images are still there. They're just fixed in place, so they're not scrolling with everything else. So we'll get to that in the next video. Thank you for watching.